Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're here to give you another video to help you improve your chess play. Today I thought I'd talk a little bit about creating imbalances. Imbalances are something where you have some sort of favorable thing, but you trade it off for something else of your opponent's that is favorable for them. If you're playing someone who's really weak, they might give you something favorable for nothing. For instance, they might give you the bishop pair without costing you any tempos or pawn structure. But when you play good players, when you get something, they get something in return. If you sacrifice the exchange, then you get some gain of king safety or maybe pawn structure or maybe a lead in development, time, things like this. So an imbalance is something that one side has that the other side doesn't. And in order to win games, you want to accumulate imbalances that are hopefully in your favor. And when grandmasters play, they tend to keep these balances in tune, and therefore a lot of grandmaster games end up in draws. And of course, that's the proper result for a game if both sides play perfectly. Some players don't like to unbalance the game that much. They like to keep things very even and only win if their opponent makes mistakes. If you watch the games of world champion Portoroz when he played the other top players in the world, that's basically what he did. He very rarely tried to unbalance the position unless he was playing a weaker player where he felt that he had to win. If he was playing one of his peers, then usually he kept the game fairly balanced. On the other hand, some players are famous for unbalancing positions. For instance, Alexei Shirov, and then his hero Mikhail, who was the world champion from Latvia. And I thought today we would look at a game from Tal-Panno in the Portoroz Interzonal in, I believe, 1958. Which is a nice unbalanced game, so it'll give us a chance to do it. I got the game out of the book Selected Games of Mikhail by Hajtun. It was an early book on Tal, published in 1961, right after he became world champion. And of course, like all old books, the notes are the best ones they could come up with at the time, but we have a little friend of ours, Stockfish 14.1, and we can look at the analysis of the position and compare it to the notes in the game. All right, so let's go over the game. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Tal is white, Panno is black. Bishop b5, Ruy Lopez. a6, bishop a4, knight f6, all the main line of the Ruy Lopez. Castle, bishop e7, closed Ruy Lopez, rook e1, b5, bishop b3. So in the old days, if you wanted to play the Marshall attack, you would castle and say to white, if you play c3, I'll play d5. And if you wanted to play the closed Ruy Lopez, you would play d6. And then if white played c3, you would castle, and then white would play h3. These days, pretty much everybody has black castles and says the Marshall attack is good for equality because they've analyzed it out with the computer. It's not that it's dull, it's just that it's been analyzed to death. And if white plays c3, black could still play d6 and go into a closed Ruy Lopez, but he could play the Marshall attack and expect to have some level of equal play. So these days, after black castles, white plays some sort of anti-Marshall, like h3 or maybe more likely a4 or d3, and plays an anti-Marshall kind of game. Now, of course, this game was played 70 years ago, so, well, not 70, but 63. So, of course, they're playing more the way that they did when I was much younger, which is for black to just, instead of castling, just play d6, which is what Panno did play. And of course, Tal plays c3, Panno castles, and Tal plays h3. And now we have the tabia of the closed Ruy Lopez. If you don't understand the moves up to now, I highly recommend you watch the second video I ever made on this channel, which is called Learning Opening Lines with the closed Ruy Lopez as an example. Okay, so h3. What are the main moves here? Well, knight a5 is the classical, knight b8 is the Breyer, bishop b7 is the Zaitsev. Those are the main lines. Black plays knight to d7, which is a rarer line. I think this is called the Kerez line. Knight to d7. And white plays the move he's been preparing for with d4. And now let's see what Stockfish says black should play. Let's pull in the Stockfish 14.1. I just downloaded that this week from the internet, updating from Stockfish 14. And it says black should play knight a5. But notice knight d7 let's see, did that even make the top 5 moves? It snuck in there at number, well, now it just fell out of the top 5. So you can see the best line for black is about a half pawn advantage for white, which is why black these days with the computer help castles instead of going into closed Roy Lopez's. But knight d7 doesn't make the top 5. So we're seeing a somewhat inferior variation here. We'll leave just a little bit of computer analysis on. So knight d7, d4, knight b6. So white's advantage here is almost a pawn already. Tal plays bishop e3, as good as anything. Here, Stockfish likes a5. Panno traded the pawns and then played knight to a5, threatening to win the bishop pair, bishop c2. And now he breaks in the center. He has nothing better with c5. And the engine likes b3 for white here with a big advantage, 1.3. Might be enough to win the game if both sides play perfectly. Tal, as to his nature, plays for some complications. Plays e5, and you can see the evaluation drops all the way down to almost equal. So the engine doesn't like that very much. Of course, in the book, they don't give it like a question mark or anything. And now black should take the e-pawn, and he does, and in the book they properly give that the exclamation point. Now it says Tal should take this pawn with a slight advantage. He takes knight takes e5 instead. And now the engine suggests knight b to c4 is dead equal. Black plays a very strange move here, and there's no comment in the book. He plays f5. I guess he was worried about attacks on h7, but I'm not sure he has to do that. Again, let's look at the top few moves by the computer and see if f5 makes it in there. All right, so f5 is not in the top 5, and notice the difference. The number 1 move is close to equal. The number 2 move is about a third of a pawn for white. The number 3 move already has 3/4 of a pawn for white. So it's pretty important that black play one of his best moves, and knight b c4 is that move. So let's go back to the game. The game, black plays f5, and the engine says, "Oh, that loses." It says Tal should take that pawn, but taking that pawn would allow black to trade queens. So Tal decides not to do that. Tal decides to play queen to d3, and you could see that's a pretty big mistake too. The engine, unless they put the game in wrong from the original notation, it looks like Tal is missing chances to win here with d takes c5 and moves like that. And the game's pretty complicated. So can grandmasters make a 4-pawn mistake in a position like this? Well, yes, they can, because they can't see 15 moves ahead perfectly. Well, not 15, but let's say 12. And Tal plays queen to d3, pinning the f-pawn to the mate, but throwing away a big advantage. And again, they give no comment in the book, but then they don't have engines like we do today. All right, so queen d3, black plays his best move, knight on b to c4. All right, and now the engine suggests that Tal should trade knights and be equal. Tal plays bishop to b3, which, is one of the best moves. Let's just show the top 2 moves here and give you a bigger board to look at. There we go. All right, so Tal plays bishop to b3, pinning the knight to the king, and black plays f4. The engine says just take that bishop off the board. Tal plays his best move, bishop d2, and the knight takes on b3. Now if Tal takes back, he has the disadvantage, so you can see he plays the best move. He plays the Zwischenzug, knight to c6, and now black has to decide what to do. The engine says the right move is to sacrifice the queen with knight takes d4. That's not an easy move for a human to find, but it is way better than the second best move. Look at the evaluation. 0, 0, 4 if you play knight takes d4, 1.51 if you play the second best move. And the second best move is what was played, and in the book they give it an exclamation point, but now we know it's not. Knight takes a1. Tal, of course, takes the queen. Knight takes d8. And black plays bishop to f5. They give that an exclamation point, and the engine says, maybe bishop takes d8 is better. Bishop takes f5, hitting the queen. He likes to give a lot of exclamation points in this game. Queen f3, hitting the rook on a8. Rook on a takes d8. And now Tal plays the only move that gives him the advantage, which is to take off the free piece. Why not? What else would he play? Rook takes e7, and we could see the engine thinks that Tal's up by 3 pawns here. Black says, all right, well, I can take a piece back too, and plays bishop here. And now we have a very interesting looking position. Black has managed to get a knight to a1 and a bishop to b1, both not attacked at the moment. But White's queen and his rook are very active on the king's side. And here the best move for Tal is the weird move bishop to e1. And look again at the difference between the best move and the second best move. 2.9 for bishop e1, 1.15 for the second best move, queen g4, threatening the mate. So if Tal finds the right move here, he's way ahead. We could say he's winning easily. If he plays any other move, he's not. Of course, it's very complicated, not easy to play. Tal plays bishop takes f4. And now the engine says if black finds rook takes d4, he's got almost equality. And in the game, black did find the best move, rook takes d4. And here, Tal's advantage is almost down to nothing. It says he should play either b3 or g3. Tal plays queen to g4, and now black is actually slightly better. Now the engine's looking a little deeper, maybe more than a little slightly better. And black should play bishop to g6, getting that bishop off the b1 square. And of course he does play the obvious bishop to g6. All right, so now Tal has the worst position, but it's still very complicated. And of course that's the kind of game that Tal likes to play. He plays his best move, queen to e6 check. Black's only move to get the advantage is bishop f7, which he does play. And Tal plays queen f5. And now the engine's looking deeper and saying, maybe black's slightly better, but not much. All right, so black has to figure out how to proceed here. After queen f5, black plays his best move, which is knight to c2. You might say, gee, why is that such a good move? The queen can just take the knight. But if the queen takes the knight, the rook takes the bishop, and White's attack is pretty much gone. He really doesn't want to give up the bishop. So White plays his best move, b3, counterattacking the other knight. A lot of complications here, a lot of pieces hanging all over the board. And here, black should play rook d1 check, and after king h2, play knight to d2. And if he does that, he has a slight advantage. Notice if he does anything else, White has a big advantage, 1.23. Notice how we're using the computer here to figure out what's critical. Well, when you have a move where the best move is minus 0.4 and the second best move is 1.2, it's critical that Panno find the right idea here. But unfortunately for him, he did not. Can't blame him. He's certainly a lot stronger player than I was, but these kind of complicated positions are tough to play. So he plays the reasonable but not correct bishop to g3, and now if Tal plays rook takes g7 check, he's got the advantage. Oh, they also point out in the book that Tal couldn't have played that earlier, so I guess we should go back and look at that. So suppose after instead of knight to c2, if black had played here first, then rook checks, king takes, bishop checks is devastating, because after king takes, queen checks, the black pieces are hanging here, and when the king comes up, let's say to the fourth rank, White will play queen takes c5, taking the defender away from the rook. All right, so let's go back to the game. So in the game, Panno didn't fall for that. He played knight c2, b3, and now he has to play rook checks and knight d2. He plays bishop there, And now the rook is guarded, so the same combination doesn't exactly work, but it's still good for white. And Tal plays the right idea. Rook takes g7 check. He's going to give up the rook and the bishop to get the rook with check, but then he'll get the knight at the end also because he's attacking the knight with b3. And the black pieces that are left will be uncoordinated. If they were coordinated, that'd be different. A rook, a bishop, and a knight are stronger than a queen when they're coordinated, and they all have good squares. But if they're kind of flying around the board, all the queen's double attack abilities are really strong. So let's see what happens in the game. King takes, bishop h6 check. That's the whole point. King takes, queen checks, king up. And now he can play queen takes pawn check, but that's not the right idea. The right idea is simply to take the knight. Will Tal figure that out? He's getting a little low on time, I guess, because they're probably playing 40 moves in 2 hours. And he does. He correctly takes the knight with a big, big lead. If he had played the incorrect takes here, then after king f6, if he takes the knight now and black takes back, this looks similar, but it actually is not nearly as good. By taking the knight first, he retains the option of doing other things than playing queen takes c5, which of course will be a threat in a lot of the lines. All right, so black plays pawn takes, and now the engine says that white's best moves are either king h2 or g4. g4 is a little bit more of a Tal move than king h2. Tal plays g3, and the engine goes, oh, no, 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 no. The engine says g4 would have given you a 3-pawn advantage. g3 only gives you a 1.2 pawn advantage. All right, so we have all these nice tools that Tal would only dream of as computers got better. All right, so g3, and now black should play bishop to e4 and set up the famous mating pattern here and make white do some work. Panno does play bishop there. Now the threat is rook e d1 check, king h2, rook h1 checkmate. So white either has to keep checking or create some luft with a move like g4, which is why g4 was better. All right, so bishop e4, they give that an exclamation point. And Tal here, his best move gives him only about a 4/10 of a pawn advantage. He plays h4 check, and now white's advantage has disappeared, and after king g4, the game should end in a draw with best play, but of course there's still a lot of play left. So king to g4 with that dreaded 0-0-0. White plays king h2. Black plays bishop there. Again, 0-0-0, so they're both playing the best moves here. We assume both players were in some time trouble here. If it's a 40-2 game, they don't mention it in the book what the time situation is, but we have to assume that they're low on time and they have to play quickly here. All right, so queen to f6, still 0-0-0. h6 best move, stopping the threat of queen g5 check. Queen e5, still 0-0-0. Rook e4. Queen checks, king f3. As long as we see that 0-0-0, we know both sides are playing either their best move or their equal best moves, but they have 3 more moves to make before they get to move 40. Queen c3 check. Knight e3. Now that may look like a mistake because you can take the knight with the pawn, but black has an idea in mind that he's going to use his king and his rook and his bishop to create mating threats and get a draw. The engine agrees that knight e3 is okay. You can see it over here on the left, that king takes f2, giving up the knight with check anyway, is a draw because he can put the rook in the way, or he can just move the king back and threaten to put the rook there. And knight in the way is also equal. So whether he takes the pawn on f2 or he plays the move he played, it's still equal. All right, so knight to e3. In the book, they don't even make any comment about that move. And now Tal plays the move he's trying to win. So he plays king to g1 to guard the pawn. You can imagine this is a tough position to play in some time trouble. Black plays bishop g4, good for him. White takes the knight. And now the best move is the very hard to find king e2. Can you imagine if this was a 40-2 game, which I assume it was, and you're black and you have 1 move to make before time control and you're down to the last, minute or 2 or even a few seconds on your clock, and you have to find the move king to e2 here. In other words, rook takes e3 is not the move, bishop h3 is not the move, none of those moves. It's to move the king to e2. That's going to be tough to do. And so we can understand here why Panno didn't find the best move. He played h5. Is that losing? Well, look at the numbers. We're now at 0.7. 0.7 isn't necessarily a win. Now it's up to 1, but 1 could also not be a win in this kind of position. But we're right on the verge now of winning. And in the book, they don't question that move. And here, Tal plays queen e1, which is almost equally best, as you could see. And they give that an exclamation point. And now Black has to play very carefully. And Black makes a move that is the best move. And in the book, they say it's the losing move. Panno plays rook takes e3. And you could see by today's standards, we could see that Panno was absolutely right to take the pawn. And they say this is the losing move. They said he should have played rook to e6 and he would have drawn the game. All right, well, rook e6 is the second best move. And after rook e6, e4, White's advantage is about 1.2. And they don't give any analysis in the book as to why Black should be able to save the game here. But they claim that rook takes e3 is the losing move. All right, so let's go back. Rook takes e3. Tal plays the best move, the only move that gives him an advantage, queen f1 check. And now Black can't take the pawn because of queen f2 check, and then if king h3, instead of taking the rook, you go queen h2 checkmate. So the king has to back out of there with king e4. Queen takes c4 check, and now the king has to come back to f3 again, which he does. Tal checks again. This is not repeating the position, by the way, because in the previous position there was no pawn on, there was a pawn on c4, and now there's not. So of course Black, for the same reason, has to go back to e4, and now White takes that pawn, and now with perfect play, king d5, maybe Black can save the game, but it's going to be really tough. So here Black plays king d4, and Stockfish says the difference between king d5 and king d4 is about a whole pawn, probably enough to lose the game. But again, they don't have these kind of engines to help them there. So king d4, if you're a human, you think, okay, well, that guards the pawn, and it helps the pawn come down the board, and it guards the rook. In general, that looks like a better move, just on general principles, doing a little hand-waving. The engine doesn't do any hand-waving. He does a lot of analysis. And Tal plays queen there, check. King c4, only move. And now the point is, this pawn is going to be really strong, and Tal correctly understands that's where his play is coming from, to push the pawn. He pushes the pawn. Panno plays his best move, rook checks. King f2. And now the engine says he could check again, but after king f1 there's no more checks. And it says he should then move the king to b4, then queen a6, and White's probably winning. Instead, Panno plays rook a2. Tal plays the correct move, queen a6 check. King to d4. a5, that pawn is a monster. Notice Black's pieces are just not coordinated enough. The king's not going to be safe enough coming in the middle of the board to try to set up a mating pattern here. Black says, well, I may as well push my pawn and try to get some counterplay. Tal accurately checks. You'd like to bring the king up in these positions, but if you bring the king up here, queen b1 check wins the rook. Well, it doesn't, but it forces the rook into a pin, and then you could push the pawn. And if he tries to put the bishop to stop the pawn, and you push, what's Black going to do? Let's say he pushes the pawn. Now you can check. He comes up. Queen e5. Black's running out of ideas. Let's say he checks. King f2. Let's say he pushes the pawn. And then queen d4 is checkmate. And the bishop's hanging anyway, so he's losing off from the left and right. All right, back to the game. So that's why Black didn't go up. He went back. King back. The engine says it really doesn't matter. You're losing. Tal says my pawn's stronger than yours. Black says, well, I can always check and maybe try to push the pawn. Tal just has to avoid a little perpetual checks here. Black pushes the pawn. White pushes the pawn. Now he's threatening to get a queen and then check and win the rook. As long as he stops this pawn from queening, that's all he needs. Black says, this is my one and only hope. But the pawn is hanging. The rook is hanging. And the king is out in the middle. So Tal can just give up on that A pawn for a second. And he plays check. And now Black doesn't want to give this pawn with check. But he doesn't want to lose the rook either. But what square can he go to where he doesn't lose the rook or the pawn with check? I guess he could go to D6, which he does. And Tal plays queen D3 check. And now Black again has a problem. If he goes to E5, he loses the rook. If he goes to the C file, he loses the pawn with check. But if he goes to the, let's say, if he goes to the 7th rank and White takes the pawn, then Black can't take the pawn because of the queen check here. So, suppose he goes to this square. All right, well, let's see if they give this analysis in here. They say if they're queen E4 check, correct, and now again we've got the problem. He either goes to the 7th rank when this pawn is going to be tough to take, or he has to go to a dark square when he loses the rook. So let's say he goes to a light square here. So let's say he goes to king to here. Then you check and you win the rook. Okay, you can't go there. So let's say he goes here. All right, but again, now you can take the pawn. And if he takes the pawn, you have a skewer. Queen H7 check. And you win the rook. And the bishop can hold, the bishop and the pawn can hold these two pawns, but the king will just come up and mate the king. If the king comes up and you take the rook, you just use your king and your queen to mate the king, and the bishop's pretty helpless to stop him. As you can see, Stockfish says he's up by 58 pawns. All right, so back to the game. So after queen D3 check, Panno saw that he was getting into that trouble where he's losing the pawn and he can't win White's pawn. And in this position where the engine properly says he could easily resign, Panno did resign here. Okay, so kind of a typical imbalanced game. The material was not very much the same throughout the whole game. After the opening, we saw that Black sacrificed his queen for a bunch of pieces, and Tal used the imbalances. We saw he didn't play perfectly. You know, the engine would have, played much, much differently when Tal first won the queen. Said that Tal, after F5, Tal missed a lot of chances in the next few moves. But even so, when the game became imbalanced and White had a lot of chances, and it was harder for Black to defend. But at the end, when the White king got trapped on the king side a little bit, Black did get some play. But eventually, White's accurate play won the game for him. All right, so that's our first game, I think, in our video series that we've ever done with Mikhail Tal. And Mikhail Tal, of course, is one of most people's chess heroes because everybody likes these slashing, sacrificial kind of play, and it's a lot of fun for the spectators. All right, hopefully you enjoyed today's video. Hopefully you can tune in again. You can subscribe to the channel. You can like the video. But the best thing you can do is tell your friends about the channel, Dan Heisman Chess. And we'll see you next time. Bye.